Every company has one employee everyone quietly depends on. And every company has a CEO who forgets that. For 11 years, one man built the reputation this company was standing on. Today, the man in the corner office decided that reputation. What happened in the next 60 seconds would be repeated in break rooms for years to come. Nobody in that room expected the quiet man to be the one who stayed calm. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply reached for the one thing that told everyone exactly who was really in control of that room.
Daniel Reyes had learned a long time ago that the people who shout the loudest in a room are rarely the ones actually holding the power. If this story makes you feel something, do him a favor before you keep reading. Hit like and subscribe, because what happened to Daniel on that factory floor is the kind of quiet justice you will not see coming, and you will not want to miss what comes after. For 11 years, Daniel Reyes had walked through the doors of Harrow Manufacturing before the sun came up, and most nights he was one of the last to leave. He was not a manager. He was not an executive. On paper, he was a quality control engineer, the man responsible for making sure the parts that left the factory floor did not fail out in the world, in the hands of people who trusted them. But anyone who had worked alongside Daniel for more than a week knew that his job title barely scratched the surface of what he actually did. He was the one new hires were quietly told to ask when nobody else had an answer. He was the one-line supervisors called at 2 in the morning when a shipment did not look right. He was steady in a way that made everyone around him a little steadier too. There was a particular rhythm to Daniel's mornings that had not changed in years. He rose before dawn, made coffee in the same chipped mug he had owned since college, and stood at the kitchen window watching the sky lighten while the coffee maker hissed behind him. By the time Mia's alarm went off down the hall, he already had breakfast started, usually something simple, eggs or oatmeal, sometimes pancakes on the days she asked especially nicely. He drove her to school himself every morning, even though it meant leaving the house earlier than he needed to, because those 12 minutes in the car, just the two of them, radio low, Mia narrating whatever cartoon plot was consuming her attention that week, had become the part of his day he protected most fiercely. Nothing at Harrow Manufacturing, no deadline, no shipment, no executive demand, was ever allowed to touch those 12 minutes. At the factory, Daniel's reputation had been built the slow way, through thousands of small, unglamorous decisions that nobody outside the plant would ever hear about. A supervisor once said that working near Daniel felt like working near a level surface. Things just seemed to sit right when he was around. He trained new engineers without ever making them feel foolish for not knowing something yet. He remembered which line worker had a kid starting college and which one had just become a grandparent. He was not loud, and he was not the kind of employee who angled for recognition in meetings. He simply did the work, carefully, every single day, and the people around him noticed, even when the people above him did not. He was also, most importantly to him, a father. His daughter Mia was 7 years old, all curls and questions, and she was the reason Daniel got up every single morning with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or production quotas. Her mother had left when Mia was 2, and since then it had been the two of them, building a small, steady life out of packed lunches, bedtime stories, and Saturday morning cartoons. Daniel did not need much. He needed his daughter fed, safe, and laughing, and Harrow Manufacturing had, for a long time, been the steady paycheck that made that possible. That steadiness had a foundation most people at the company did not know about. Years earlier, under the company's founder, a stubborn and fair man named Walter Harrow, Daniel had designed a safety mechanism that fixed a defect responsible for 2 serious accidents on the production line. Walter had been so grateful and so aware of how easily young engineers got taken advantage of by companies that used their ideas and discarded them, that he had done something unusual. He had quietly written Daniel into a small protective ownership clause tied to the patent behind that mechanism, a clause buried deep in legal paperwork that gave Daniel a permanent, non-transferable veto right over any change to the company's core safety protocols. It was never about money. Walter had told him back then that some things should never depend on whoever happens to be sitting in the corner office. Daniel had nodded, thanked him, and largely forgotten about it. He was not a man who thought of himself as powerful. He was a man who thought of himself as responsible. Walter passed away 3 years before this story begins, and control of Harrow Manufacturing shifted to his son, Nathaniel. Where Walter had built the company slowly, with patience and respect for the people on the floor, Nathaniel wanted growth, and he wanted it immediately. Under his leadership, deadlines tightened, safety inspections were quietly shortened, and the culture on the floor shifted from careful to rushed. Daniel watched it happen the way you watch weather change, aware something was building but unsure exactly when it would break. It broke on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. Harrow Manufacturing had landed its largest contract in company history, a deal with a national distributor that would double revenue if fulfilled on time. The only problem was the final batch of hydraulic housing units scheduled to ship that week had failed 2 of Daniel's standard stress tests, not by a small margin, by a margin that told him with absolute certainty that if those units went out and were installed the way they were meant to be installed, something would eventually fail catastrophically in the field. Daniel flagged the batch the way he had flagged dozens of batches over 11 years. He wrote up the report, attached the test data, and sent it up the chain with a simple recommendation: hold the shipment 48 hours for a corrected run. It was routine. It was his job. What he did not expect was for Nathaniel Harrow himself to come down to the factory floor in response. Nathaniel arrived flanked by 2 junior executives, his expensive shoes clicking hard against the concrete floor, his face already tight with frustration before he reached Daniel's station. He did not pull Daniel aside privately. He stopped in the open walkway, in full view of a dozen workers who had gathered nearby for a shift changeover, and he told Daniel flatly that the shipment was going out on schedule, defect report or not. Daniel, calm as always, tried to explain the risk in plain terms, the same way he had explained it 100 times before to people who listened. Nathaniel did not listen. He told Daniel this was not a discussion, that the client was not going to accept another delay, and that Daniel needed to sign off on the batch immediately. Daniel said he could not do that in good conscience, not with test results showing what they showed. And that was when Nathaniel Harrow, in front of everyone, said the words that would follow him for a long time after. He told Daniel to do as he was told, or quit. He said a single dad with a daughter to feed could not afford to be difficult about paperwork. He said it like it was a threat wrapped in concern, the kind of comment designed to remind a man of exactly how replaceable he believed him to be. The factory floor went silent. Machines still hummed in the background, but every person nearby had stopped moving. They all knew Daniel. They all respected him, and in that moment, they all watched to see what he would do with an ultimatum that felt designed to humiliate him. For a moment, nobody breathed. A young line worker named Priya, who had started only 8 months earlier and still asked Daniel at least one question a day, felt her stomach drop, certain she was about to watch a man twice her age be torn apart in front of everyone for doing exactly what he was supposed to do. An older machinist named Reuben, who had worked the floor for over 20 years and rarely reacted to anything anymore, found himself gripping the edge of his workstation, waiting. Somewhere behind the small crowd, someone had quietly pulled out a phone, unsure whether to record. Unsure whether this was the kind of moment you were supposed to remember, or the kind you were supposed to look away from. Daniel felt the weight of all those eyes on him, and beneath the calm exterior he had built over 11 years of practice, something in his chest tightened. He thought briefly of Mia, of the mortgage payment due in 9 days, of the quiet arithmetic he had run in his head more than once over the years, about how thin the margin was between comfortable and struggling for a single father raising a daughter alone. Walking away from a paycheck was not a small thing. It was not a dramatic gesture made without cost. But he also thought of the 2 accident reports he had read years earlier, the reason Walter Harrow had trusted him with something important in the first place, and he thought about what it would mean to sign his name to a decision he knew, with certainty, could hurt someone. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not argue further. He looked at Nathaniel for a long moment, the kind of look that carries more weight than any shouted response could, and then he set down his measuring gauge on the workstation with a quiet, deliberate click. He reached up and unclipped his ID badge from his shirt pocket. He did not throw it. He did not make a scene. He simply placed it on the table beside his tools, turned and walked toward the supply closet, where he kept a small cardboard box for exactly this kind of day, a box he had never expected to actually need. He packed slowly and calmly. A framed photo of Mia from her kindergarten graduation, a coffee mug she had painted for him one Father's Day, uneven letters spelling out Best Dad, a worn paperback he kept in his drawer for lunch breaks. Coworkers drifted closer, some quietly asking if he was serious, if he was really going to walk out over one shipment. Daniel told them gently that it was never really about one shipment. It was about what happens when the people making decisions stop listening to the people who actually know the risk. He shook a few hands. He told the younger engineers to keep asking questions even when it was uncomfortable. And then he picked up his box and walked the long aisle toward the exit doors, past workstations, past machinery, past Nathaniel Harrow, who stood frozen near the whiteboard, momentarily unsure whether he had just won or lost something enormous. For about 18 hours, Nathaniel believed he had won. The batch shipped on schedule. The contract stayed intact. He told his executive team that sometimes leadership meant making hard calls, even if it meant losing a stubborn employee who had, in his words, gotten too comfortable questioning authority. Then, the next morning, the company's general counsel called an emergency meeting. Buried in the original patent agreement behind the hydraulic housing mechanism, the very mechanism used in the batch that had just shipped, was Daniel Reyes's protective veto clause, written personally by Walter Harrow years earlier. It stated, in plain legal language, that no safety-related override could occur on that specific product line without Daniel Reyes's written sign-off, regardless of his employment status. Firing him or accepting his resignation over exactly this kind of override did not remove that clause. It activated a mandatory compliance freeze on the entire product line until the issue was resolved. A freeze that legally required the company to halt shipment and notify their distribution partner of a safety review. Nathaniel sat in that meeting as the reality settled over him. The man he had humiliated in front of a dozen employees, the man he had called replaceable, had quietly held more legal control over the company's most important product line than Nathaniel himself did. The national contract, the one he had risked everything for, was now suspended pending review, and the only person who could lift that freeze was the very man Daniel had walked out the door the day before. Word moved through the company fast. By the time Nathaniel worked up the nerve to call Daniel personally, half the factory floor already knew what had happened, and most of them were quietly, fiercely proud. Daniel let the phone ring twice before answering. He was in his kitchen at the time, helping Mia with a puzzle spread across the table. The late afternoon sun coming through the window the same soft gold as it had on the factory floor the day before. Nathaniel's voice on the other end was careful, stripped of its usual sharpness, asking Daniel to come back, offering to fix things, offering, eventually, more money than he had ever offered before. Daniel listened patiently, the way he always did. And then he said something that would later get repeated so often around the company that it practically became legend. He said he did not want more money. He wanted the safety review protocol restored to what Walter Harrow had originally built it to be, permanent, protected, and never again subject to a single executive's convenience. He wanted a written apology delivered to the entire factory floor, not just to him, and he wanted a guarantee, in writing, that no employee raising a legitimate safety concern would ever again be threatened with their job in front of their coworkers. Nathaniel, cornered and out of options, agreed to all of it. The 4 days between that phone call and Daniel's return were quiet ones inside the Reyes household, though the rest of the company seemed to move at a different speed entirely. Word had already spread through every department by the second day, passed from the factory floor up through the offices, growing slightly with each retelling, until some versions of the story had Daniel owning half the company outright, which was not true, and others had Nathaniel Harrow personally driving to Daniel's house to apologize on his knees, which was also not true, though considerably closer to how Nathaniel actually felt. What was true was simpler and, in its own way, more remarkable. A man who had spent 11 years quietly doing the right thing, without ever asking for credit or leverage, had finally been forced to use the one piece of leverage he never wanted, and he had used it not to enrich himself, but to protect the very people who worked beside him every day. During those 4 days, Daniel did not spend his time celebrating or gloating, not that it was in his nature to do either. He spent one afternoon at Mia's school for a parent conference that he might have otherwise had to reschedule around a factory shift. He fixed a loose hinge on the back door that had been squeaking for months. He sat with Mia at the kitchen table one evening, helping her sound out words from a library book about a lighthouse keeper, and when she asked him out of nowhere whether he was going back to his old job, he told her honestly that he did not know yet, but that whatever happened, they were going to be okay. She had nodded, satisfied with that answer in the easy way children often are, and gone back to her book, and Daniel had sat there a moment longer, grateful that she never had to fully understand how close things had come to being difficult. Daniel returned to Harrow Manufacturing 4 days later, not as a quiet quality control engineer working in the background, but as the newly appointed Director of Safety and Compliance, a position created specifically around the protections his old friend Walter had once written into the fine print. He walked back through those same factory doors, past the same machines, and this time every single person on that floor stood up from their stations, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect, and gave him a standing ovation that echoed off the steel walls for a full minute. That evening, Daniel picked Mia up from school like he always did. She asked him, the way she asked most days, how work had gone. He smiled, buckled her into her booster seat, and told her that sometimes doing the right thing feels small and lonely in the moment it happens. and that it can still turn out to matter more than anyone expected. Mia did not fully understand what he meant, not yet, but she would one day, when she was old enough to hear the whole story, the story of the quiet single dad who packed a small cardboard box, walked calmly out a door, and left an entire company speechless without ever raising his voice once.